Maybe we should actually start doing that episode.
This is about buildings and cities. I'm George Kinjal.
I'm Luke Jones, and we are going to be talking about John Soane again. In this case, Westminster.
At the last episode, I thought, hardly has there been a topic for which I feel less equipped to deal with. And I think that is even more true this time.
This is a real hard one. In a way, this is also a lifetime project, although it has phases of paper architecture, phases of kind of hiatus and sort of like sulky revising of ideas in secret.
Did he sulk whenever he didn't get exactly what he wanted?
Yeah, I think
which
so.
would be a megalomaniac schemes.
Trying to show the world how they'd been wrong. This is a drawing from his book of designs for London, which he published in the late 1820s towards the end of his life, but it is a reprise of something from the gay dawn of youth, his design for a British Senate, which he'd done actually on the Grand Tour in the in late 1770s, I think.
It's interesting because we don't have a Senate.
We don't have one. What does he mean by it? It's basically just like a building for the two houses of Parliament. Yeah,
I mean, it's got two halves. It seems to have a strange ratio of building to bits you could actually put things in.
Yeah, it's like a lot of there's a lot of architectural language and not a huge amount of inhabitability. We did talk about it on the first episode, but it's this neoclassicized version of the big Bernini square in front of St. Peter's, but then like doubled on both sides. And it's sited on Westminster, and it has this funny little kind of quirk, which is that his triumphal bridge is also. It's like we're kind of building out the cinematic universe here. The Triumphal Bridge, which is another of his youthful projects, is in the background of this picture.
It's got a lot of columns.
It's a lot of columns, a lot of porticos. It's very grand, I presume it's very Corinthian, which is his
slightly Soviet
preferred mode. Yeah, it does.
Slightly Stalinist.
And it also, looks like a kind of organism growing out of control in some ways.
It would be interesting to see. They turned the whole of the Bank of England into office cubicles before they demolished it. It would be interesting to see what this was like once it had all been turned into office cubicles.
Okay. Would they all be in the arms, or maybe in sort of?
I think
maybe a bit.
The principle with the Bank of England was to turn every single bit of space and sort of make things.
They could kind of sort of roof it over with a kind of rather dingy space frame, like they did in front of King's Cross during the 80s. That could be the could be the approach.
It could be full of suspended ceilings.
Yeah, the existence of this little piece of paper architecture, I think, must owe something to the contemporary reputation of Westminster and the spaces for the Houses of Parliament at the time, which was not exactly good. They were generally regarded as being very small, very imperfect, quite unpleasant to inhabit, and not really befitting a proper country.
The process that had happened is, originally there wasn't really. Parliaments were called ad hoc by the king.
Yeah.
And there wasn't really a particular place for them. And in fact, there wasn't really a distinct place for government until the 17th century.
Yeah.
It was all bits of court. There was one large and one enormous palace, both extremely degraded, around Westminster. The large one being Westminster Palace, which the kings moved out of pretty early.
Yeah.
It was a kind of remains of a Gothic palace that hadn't really had any major work done to it since the 14th century. And then north of there was Whitehall Palace, which at one time was the biggest palace in Europe, but has a plan that looks like it was designed by ants. It is really something incredible. And that was destroyed at the beginning of the 18th century, and slowly, ad hoc, they sort of put government buildings in. But at this point, we're at a point in history where there are thousands of civil servants.
Yeah.
And the organs of government are inhabiting a strange collection of medieval and ad hoc constructed buildings.
Yeah.
Which is funny, given that Britain is fast becoming... by the end of this building progress, would be the greatest power in the world. Before, in fact, really anything was substantially done about it.
Yeah, Soane has this kind of lifelong involvement, sometimes officially, sometimes unofficially, with Westminster. And it's quite hard to describe what it was like. Actually, the plan and the sort of the way in which it's laid out is quite important in order to be able to describe the project. So we're going to have to figure out a way of doing it. If we think about what it's like now, the Victorian Houses of Parliament, which is there, is this enormously long building which runs all the way down and is built right on the edge of the river.
And it's one thing.
Yeah.
Which is very different to these buildings.
Yeah.
Which are really, although it's called the Palace of Westminster,
it's really
just a succession of buildings built onto each other over the course of, Westminster Hall was built by William Rufus in the 11th century, and other bits were built on, I guess there's probably something from each 100 years between them then and...
Sounds good, yeah.
You know, and the point, and including sort of in the middle of it, there's pubs and
coffee houses,
coffee shops, and
random people's houses. I think
stables and things,
not necessarily at all related to the the operation of any of the institutions there. It's if you compare it with what's there now it's right hard against the edge of the river, and it's this very, very long building with these big towers, one at each end. Then it was set back a bit further from the river.
It was much smaller.
Yeah, much smaller. The river at Westminster has bent round and it's running basically north-south. I think that the core diagram, if you're trying to imagine, is a bit like a capital F, but upside down. So with the bottom of the F kind of pointing downriver towards the rest of the city. And the stem of the F is made up of these two halls. Westminster Hall, which is the kind of the Great Hall, and a little hall, which at this point is the Court of Chancery.
I thought it was the Court of Requests.
Court of Requests, yes, that's good.
But which had actually closed at this point.
Oh, okay. And then, the arms of the F are, the sort of middle arm is St. Stephen's Chapel, which is the House of Commons at this point. And the top of the F is the Painted Chamber, which is a kind of grand medieval chamber with wall paintings in.
Which they had carefully covered up at that point.
They had been painted white by the Puritans, and then I think was kind of recovered around 1800 maybe, or
yes, but at this point it was all hung with tapestries.
Yeah, the House of Lords itself is sort of in another little building, which is a bit like a sort of serif on the top of the F, and then that's just the kind of core diagram. There are, I don't know, about 50 other little buildings all built around it of various uses and types. And then there's also a garden. There's a cloister and a garden in between it and the river, which is kind of a bit further away.
Bits of stuff left over from when it was a palace, like tennis courts and bowling greens and things.
Yeah.
And stables and wood yards and lots of courts. We don't need to go through the legal system at this time, but it was strange.
Yeah. So, both Parliament and also the courts are in this complex.
Yeah.
They're there together.
I mean, most of these things started off as legal. The law went on all the time in the kind of ancien regime, and parliaments happened very sporadically.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I've got some pics of various bits of it. Westminster Hall, which is still there, is this enormous big hall, and it also had some courts in it.
It was a lot of the time it was sort of in the period before then here, the most serious trials all went on in Westminster Hall.
Yeah. And then the House of Commons is a very strange setup. It was...
this classic thing of, we've got a really large, rickety old building.
Yeah.
What we're going to do is build another building inside it.
Yeah. Christopher Wren built a kind of wooden debating chamber inside this existing Gothic chapel, which I think was quite amazing piece of architecture in its own right, although possibly not in very good nick. And it's inside it like a ship in a bottle. It's completely bizarre. The
House of Commons is completely within St. Stephen's Chapel.
Yeah.
But you would have you didn't touch any of the walls, floor, ceiling of St. Stephen's Chapel. It's just a box inside.
What a crazy thing to do.
Well, they had a big building they weren't using, build another one inside it.
There is kind of a bit of it feels like a lot of there's a sort of English ethos of kind of fuck it, that'll do.
It's very much what's going
there?
on. The strange thing is that underneath all of this there are very grand Gothic spaces that are in very bad nick.
I think that a lot of, certainly Soane and probably other architects, feel that they're kind of pushing up against that sort of ethos, like why can't we do things properly like they do in France?
Yeah.
And then
No, you're going to make a wooden box inside this big Gothic building.
Yeah.
Sort of nullifying both things.
Yeah. Very bizarre.
That's the painted chamber.
Yeah, the
with
painted
all the
chamber.
tapestries up.
Yeah. So the painted
Do
chamber.
you like the way they hung the tapestries?
Yeah, I don't.
They've like nailed wooden battens to the wall and then nailed the tapestries to the battens.
Yeah. Okay. That's good. That's good. They'll keep them on, I guess. So the painted chamber was recovered, I think, around in the late 18th century. They kind of took some of the whitewash off and discovered all of these pictures, and there are lots and lots of. It seems like it was a very interesting and sadly lost bit of medieval art. The House of Lords is the one that they think is in the worst condition at this point because it's very small.
There's lots of lords, although they are generally dilettantes.
Yeah.
Barely coming in many cases.
Yeah.
Not
like today.
Not like today. Well, no, they've got to come in the morning to get their subsidy. Pick up the food stamps. You should at least theoretically have enough space for them to get in, which was not the case at all.
Yeah, and it also very badly ventilated. Soane was appointed to a position at the Office of Works that had some responsibility for this. I think it was a clerkship in the 1790s. And William Chambers was the Surveyor General, which is the kind of main position. There seems to have been some kind of tension between them because I think Chambers thought that Soane was sort of bustling in, and
which he probably was.
Almost certainly was. And there are these sort of simple schemes initially that they would need to try and improve the conditions in the Lords and get better ventilation and all sorts of things. But quite early on in 1794, Soane basically comes up with the idea of what he wants to do. At least this is my reading. If you go on the Soane archive, there are just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of plans from this scheme, and that people are not totally sure when all of them are from. He did lots of confusing things like redrawing some of these earlier schemes in the character of how he drew them at the time. But then 30 years later or whatever, it's all incredibly confusing. But I think he seems to have come up with what he thought should be done to the Lords pretty early on, which is if you imagine the kind of upside down F, the top of the F is pointing south. He thought that they should build a new building basically running across the bottom of Parliament facing south. And that they should essentially build another big room off the end of the painted chamber, and that big room should be the Lords. The Lords should be a new building, and that then there would be a new kind of major axis coming in from the south to kind of complement the major one coming in from the north into Westminster Hall, which he has some sort of ideas about what the major spaces should be like. And he seems to have originated that idea unofficially before he had any kind of appointment to look at this
and then agitated for it for the next 40 years.
Yes.
Yeah.
Going bigger and bigger and bigger. He's kind of got that idea, and then I'm not totally clear how the story of all of this works exactly, but he then is sort of appointed to actually look at it would be a kind of big neoclassical building running across the south.
And you get sort of three big facades.
Yeah.
A long southern facade, which would have a central block and two kind of pavilion wings. A short riverside. I'm going to say the things that are kind of common to all the schemes.
Yeah.
A short riverside, which has got a portico on it of some sort, and a slightly longer one facing west.
Yeah. Towards what's now Westminster Square and Westminster Abbey,
so it's a building with sort of three fronts.
Yeah.
Of kind of varying lengths, and buried in the middle of it is the chamber.
Yeah.
And then there's a central axis coming up from the south, and accommodation that's not the main debating chamber off a big corridor running east-west.
Part of the issue is that the way he illustrates all of these is incredibly light on context, and often is completely decontextualized. So in this particular picture, which is a Gandhi picture we're looking at from around 1800, Westminster Abbey does creep into the corner, although not very recognisably. But in lots of them, you just don't see it at all. And it took me ages to figure out where any of this is, because it's in a completely different style, and it's seemingly completely antithetical to what the rest of Westminster is actually like at this time. And for a long time, I was just reading this as a kind of complete kind of tabula rasa greenfield
Whereas in
scheme.
fact, it's a bit like that. And calling it the House of Lords is a bit funny as well, because the House of Lords is in it, but what percentage do you think is actually the House of Lords?
Yeah,
like
about 10.
10?
Yeah.
10, 20% if you add in all the bits.
Yeah.
It's a new building for Parliament. And he quite clearly wanted to replace the whole Palace of Westminster, in fact. And it was going to be an explicitly neoclassical new Parliament building.
So there are there are lots and lots of versions. He kind of goes through all sorts of permutations of the sort of portico in the middle, other porticos on the ends.
Slightly sort of Lutyensy domes on the side wings.
These
on
are
this
cool,
one.
aren't they? Yeah. These ones, we're looking at one where the ends are very stressed and much bigger than the middle, which is kind of fun.
Which is, I think, actually what he sort of wanted to do.
Yeah.
But this was never particularly popular.
That one is quite strange with an enormous portico.
Yeah.
And then there's basically a sequence of there's just hundreds of these plans, but one of the things that I think you can see is it starts off being quite pragmatic and sort of responding to the brief as given by the client. And you can see him kind of evolving it towards his desired outcome.
This is an early scheme we're looking at. What he's done there is build the facade he wants facing the river.
Yeah.
Shoved the bits of minor accommodation, sort of offices and things, behind it. Put the House of Lords behind that. And then left a nice big space for his other facade.
In this one, he's not really knocking down anything. Even the existing Lords is still there.
Yeah.
And actually, it's common to a lot of them that the existing buildings are all there, but they're increasingly kind of encased in this new architecture.
Because you'd be making an argument, wouldn't you? Be going, well, we can save money by doing this and get people to fixate on that rather than everything else you're doing.
In this one, he's redone the painted chamber.
Yeah, with columns.
With columns and vaults and things. And then this one is the one which was agreed.
So he did eventually get to a point where they said, rather like some current pledges that the government makes every now and again, we will rebuild this.
We'll do it.
When economic conditions allow, such as when we're not at war.
So yeah, he gets it in front of the king, and the king is a fan. And he thinks that he's kind of landed it. I think this is around sort of 1797-ish, isn't it? It's kind of late 1790s. He thinks he's got it, and he thinks it's kind of in the bag, although obviously it's a bit difficult for the country to afford.
Yes, there were some other things going on in the 1790s, which would continue to go on for a while, actually, on the continent. But it doesn't work out for him.
Yeah,
do we want to actually describe this scheme more? I mean, it is essentially the same thing. There's an east-west... So there's the two grand facades. One has got a central bit with a pediment, two wings, and he never got them to sign off on the domes.
Yeah.
And then a riverfront, which is a sort of, neoclassical temple projecting out of a bigger block. That goes off the spine of a long corridor.
Yeah.
And essentially its rooms off that. And we're beginning to see that all of these designs for big institutional buildings have big, long corridors in them, which I think was a relatively new phenomenon.
He's a partisan of the big, long corridor, and he thought they were... And I mean, I think he makes a good case for them as well. They are very interesting, the way he kind of designs and breaks them up. It's a funny plan because it's got this very uneven weighting. You can see the bits of original Gothic fabric which are being retained in various places, which have a real, a lot more mass, and which have then been sort of carefully sculpted.
It's a different argument for retaining these often quite originally grand Gothic buildings with their beautiful art and stuff. Well, you just stucco over everything.
Yeah.
You encase all the old masonry in new masonry, so you can't tell it's old.
Yeah.
And you just be walking through a wall and think, this wall is jolly thick.
It's very funny. But yeah, no, he does think that he's kind of landed this. And then there is... Oh, maybe we'll tell the story of how it falls apart in a second. We could kind of go through some of the key spaces of this proposal. Because,
But it's funny. It's very neoclassical.
Yeah, it's super neoclassical. It looks like something from...
It's got detached colonnades, it's got a rusticated base, it's got openings with columns set within it.
Yeah.
Tall windows with pediments on top of them.
A lot of them have this rather optimistic kind of river frontage with steps going down into the Thames as well, which at this point in history would be covered in poos and dead animals. And
yes, various bits of animal and fecal matter.
Yeah, it's not exactly Lake Como, is it?
No.
So yeah, he has This really interesting design for a great hall, which sometimes is a redressing of the painted chamber, but I think it does also move to the littler of the great halls as well at some point.
Here we have got a fantastic example of Soane's perpetual desire to make buildings, to make the rooms seem as big as possible.
Yeah. But it's kind of, so it's got they're like square bays with cross vaults.
Yeah.
And then the vaults are held up on these projecting Doric columns.
Yeah.
Which is all standing proud of the wall.
Stand on a sort of plinth.
Yeah.
Projecting into the room. So the cross vaults and stuff feels very Roman, but then it's on Doric, which doesn't feel very Roman. And it's got Roman decoration in the roof, sort of thing, or their idea of that.
Although it's very big. It's like overscaled decoration.
Yeah, well, I wonder if it's very big, or if the room is actually nothing like as big as it's made out to be in this image. It's also got the semicircular windows under these round vaults are all glazed with a sort of radiating pattern of leading.
Yeah.
A bit like the back of a bomber. Feels a bit sort of proto-industrial, which is an interesting combination of not terribly like elements, but it does seem to hold together, at least in this propaganda image.
Yeah.
Do you think the doors are twice as tall as the people?
I've no idea. Yeah, very difficult to know. He has this kind of ideal entrance sequence with these two spaces, which I don't think he ever actually manages to get into the consented form, scheme in the form that he wants to, which are, you would go in and there would be this grand regal staircase, a Scala Regia, and then at the top there would be this big domed space called the Great Hall of Reception, I think is what it's called.
Yeah, which doesn't look actually that big. The Hall of Reception, so in the middle of this grand southern front, in these schemes, there would be, I don't know what you call it when you've got a kind of bay of columns coming out.
What,
a round thing of columns coming out.
I don't know.
Anyway, you'd have one of those, you'd go through that, and there'd be 3 flights of stairs leading up to this big door, and above that, one of these big semicircular
vaults
with a huge window, a huge span of glass.
Yeah.
Sort of impossible before that time. So this mixture of sort of industrial and heavily classical. And it's an unusual space. I can't think of somewhere exactly like this.
Yeah, the stairs are really wide, but they've got statues on plinths like in the middle of the stairs. So the stairs are kind of interrupted.
Yeah, it feels a bit like something you might get in one of the big sort of World Fair built. You know, like in Barcelona, there's that bit going up which has got the museums in it and things. Or
something
big
like that.
neoclassical staircase with plinths in it.
Yeah, it's cool. It's a cool space. This one, I like that.
I think that semicircular window is very different. It really separates the sections. Here also the sections are coloured differently. I wonder if it almost looks like you're going from a big arched building to a separate building, which is a kind of Corinthian thing with a huge bit of glass in front of it.
It would read that way, yeah. So the kind of internal facade of what you're going towards has got a little sort of setback, so that it would sort of read.
Yeah.
You wouldn't see the way that it joins the hall that you're in.
It's very Soanean.
Yeah.
But it's, unlike the works that we're more familiar with him, it's very neoclassical, but not conventional.
And then, the other big space is this Great Hall of Reception. Has a big kind of hanging pendentive dome.
But this one's sort of more Adamy.
Very white and light, and it has, it has more of these really big semicircular windows all around it, kind of lighting into it.
Here we get to the it's pendentive, but it's a whole circle that's been, a whole sphere, hemisphere that's been cut, which means, again, you get these very large semicircular windows.
There's this amazing series of really simple white and grey Gandhi watercolours of the different spaces in this building, which are just kind of blocking it out in light and shade, which are so great. I was saying before the show, they're kind of like storyboard drawings or something. There's a kind of like pictorial blocking out of...
level of detail in the perspective, though, is very high. I mean, you can see it's been done quickly.
Yes, up here in the dome, there's a lot of kind of broadly correct rendering of a very complicated coffered ceiling. But it doesn't come to pass. The project stalls both for practical reasons and also for reasons of politics, and he's outmaneuvered by a guy called James Wyatt, who is his rival. I think they genuinely had some kind of animus between them. Wyatt was the one who read out this rude poem about his Bank of England at the Architects Club at one point. Yeah, he kind of outmaneuvers him through various means. I think partly through his friendship with the wife of, what's his name? But one of the other famous politicians who's not Pitt. One of the kind of conversations is about the appropriateness of the style of this proposal, which is the neoclassical proposal. And what they end up doing is a Gothic-styled proposal on a much more modest scale. Wyatt ends up being appointed to move the House of Lords into the littler of the two great halls, the then Court of Requests, and to do a bit of building on the outside of it, which is in a Gothic-ish style, normally described as Gothic with a K, to kind of indicate that it's kind of scenographic, kind of landscape garden Gothic, not actually kind of antiquarian Gothic. It was described as
the cotton mill building because of its grid of windows.
Yeah, it's not much loved, this building. People at the time don't seem to have liked it very much.
Although I think for similar reasons that they didn't like a lot of the Soane buildings in Whitehall, which is that you have this monstrous clients who are constantly changing the scheme all the time, and then it sort of starts going under budget, and then you start cutting all the nice things, and then they muck it around again, and then you have to change the design because one lot of people complain about it, and then it's built, and they're all like, "Well, you've been rubbish.
Yeah, this is terrible. You've done exactly what we said, and it's awful."
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
a pattern that seems to happen to a lot of the Whitehall proposals.
What's crazy is how much time in the House of Commons seems to be spent discussing architecture. People standing up and denouncing the style in which things have been built.
Well, I mean, it's just a group of dilettantes, isn't it?
Soane, as you'd imagine, kind of broods and stews away on this, and he does kind of continue the scheme himself.
Oh, what's this? This is a scheme that is actually 5 times bigger.
Yeah, and he does these versions where he kind of continues it round the corner and kind of completes a river facade that runs the whole length of the building. Also creates a new home for the House of Commons, which would have made a lot of sense.
Which was going to be square.
Yeah, which becomes this kind of set of two neoclassical buildings looking down onto this limpid blue depths of Old Father Thames.
Do you think these are good neoclassical facades?
These ones are kind of weak, aren't they?
Yeah, I would say they're not very good.
Yeah, for me, they've got a touch of the Willie Wilkins about them. They look like the National Gallery, which is another not very good facade.
Nothing is either kind of soft enough or strong enough. This doesn't feel like the centre of a great empire, if that's what the image you're wanting to project. I don't think he's ever quite able to do this grand... I don't think he ever can kind of pull together an idea that makes the exterior look great. They all seem like watered down versions of his bridge.
I think
the elements are kind of awkward in relationship to each other.
I think there's a kind of emphasis problem as well, which we saw in some of the early drawings where the ends are weirdly big. He's made the kind of river and the Westminster elevations on the east and west kind of weirdly big, and the middle is weirdly undersized. Or
in the bridge, the sort of big bits are in funny places.
Yeah, we're looking at a picture of Wyatt's building on fire, which it would
So we got the last laugh,
Yeah. Pugin wrote a letter talking about how much he loved seeing all of this on fire.
All the mock Gothic.
Well, this kind of, as a proper antiquarian who knew a lot about Gothic, he was rather offended.
That's not very fair, because I mean, I would say what he ended up doing is pretty mock Gothic too.
Yeah. Okay, so we're kind of dotting around to cover all of this stuff, but Soane gets another go at the House of Lords and at Parliament.
This is, by the way, before it burns down.
Yeah,
obviously.
The
burning down is rather later.
Yeah, in the 1820s, he gets another go. The Napoleonic Wars are over, and also there's a new king, who's
Georgie Porgy Pudding Pie,
George the Fourth. Do you know the story of Albany, Who's Your Fat Friend? Do you know that one?
Yes.
famously cutting little quip by contemporary dandy and pioneer of male fashion, Beau Brummel. Yeah. That's one of the things, actually, that John Soane lived through, interestingly, is the great male renunciation in fashion. When he was a young man, like men dressed like Jimi Hendrix or Prince or whatever, and when he's an old man, it's all black.
Black and white.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things he loses when his trunk breaks as a grand tourist is his fine suit of blue velvet, I think.
Yes. Wearing 3 multicoloured silk waistcoats.
Pink shoes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so George IV, who had been Prince Regent, was very fat and also drunk and also addicted to laudanum. Generally a bit of a bon vivant. And I mean, he wants to do various things. The first thing he wants to do is to divorce his wife, Queen Caroline, who he'd been separated from for about 20 years. And then he also wants a kind of easier way of getting in and out of Parliament in his carriage for kind of obvious reasons. I think also because actually various insane people had tried to kill his father as well. And
Yes. Who also was an insane person.
who was also intermittently insane, yeah, but was not mad at the time that he said that John Soane's, or not considered to be mad at the time that he said that John Soane's design was very nice. Yeah, so Soane's actual first new involvement in the Lords in the 1820s.
Monarchy may not always be the best system of government.
They had the trial of Queen Caroline for adultery, this was the constitutionally necessary thing to do in order for him to get divorced, was that he had to prove her adultery in a court of the House of Lords.
Yes.
And all the peers were required to attend.
And the bishops.
And Soane built, we're looking at a picture of it, Soane built these like little galleries, these cast iron little galleries, so that they could pack them all in to watch this thing happen. She was obviously guilty, and they did find her guilty, but it was considered such bad form that they had to withdraw the bill and not put it before the Commons. And then she died the next year anyway. So, but he gets a slightly more substantial commission to build, a kind of new entrance. And you got to, if we try and orient ourselves on the site again, this also is at the House of Lords end, at the south end of the complex, and it's kind of closing the corner, pointing inland, pointing
this is
west.
Quite a way. The current building extends quite a bit further south.
Yeah.
Than this ever would have gone.
There's what they call a porte cochère, which I think is a sort of coach port, and a little Gothic-y kind of curving walkway. And then there's a new sequence of entrance rooms, and then that develops into a royal gallery, and then they also then add some committee rooms for the use of Parliament. So it sort of grows and grows.
In a way, he's always he's always wanting to build grand ceremonial spaces, and sweetens the deal with the fact that they just don't have nearly enough office space. So, incredibly important person, you could have a modest office in this scheme.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The quid pro quo is, the quid pro quo literally is, we're going to do a Scala Regia, albeit on like a slightly less grand scale than in the original scheme. It doesn't, in this case,
well, the Scala Regia itself is only the Scala Regia, the entrance system is not that much less grand. It's just that it doesn't really have much building associated with it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting because it's a kind of early example of a building which seems to have been designed round the turning circle of a vehicle.
Yeah.
Which is kind of...
I mean, I think that had already been happening. I think that all starts beginning of the 18th century. You get French examples, but yes.
Yeah, and then the Scala Regia is much
It's a much less exciting version of the much. And it doesn't have the huge semicircular window.
I think in the early part of the scheme, it was like entrance, stairway, and then we're going to have some rooms up there, which are for the king.
Yeah.
And so there was a version of it. This is a version where it's got columns around the edge and it's got sort of pendentive dome and a really grand big lantern on top, which looks a bit like an even bigger version of some of those Bank of England lanterns with statues and things.
Except I think actually it's probably quite a lot smaller because this room doesn't actually look very big.
Yeah.
It does, under all the size of the pendentive dome, there are windows.
Yes, this one would have been very light and it's got lots of pictures on the wall.
Rather loose green marble columns.
Yeah. And then this was a version of the gallery. It's got quite a difficult to describe section.
The room itself feels like that Palladio Egyptian hall, as in it's a long, a long thin rectangular room.
Yeah.
Where you offset the wall by a certain amount and have columns.
Yeah. It's kind of like a covered courtyard or something with a big lantern over it. But the aisles, as it were, are taller
Yes.
the internal courtyard, so that they kind of pop up and you get light coming in through a kind of vertical clerestory window into those aisles,
But
in quite
only
a clever way.
Only on the side that's into the room. So you just see light washing down the side walls.
Yeah.
I think it would have had a good effect.
It's quite cool, isn't it? I think that he sort of develops versions of this idea, and I think there might be something like this in the house, don't you think?
Yeah, I can't think of a really convincing built example of this roof.
Yeah.
He does very many roofs. He builds a lot of them. He does a lot of pendentive domes and star domes and semicircular domes
Yeah.
and rooms with semicircular windows, but I can't think of this one really.
Anyway, what he ends up with basically is we're going to have this royal gallery, which will be a series of 3 domes in a row. There are different versions of that scheme that they go through. There's one I really like where the domes have painted pictures of blue sky and clouds on them, which feel like vaguely like Tiepolo type paintings or something like that. It feels very light and rococo-y.
It's difficult to judge how these rooms really would have been.
Yeah.
You can immediately tell they're Soane.
Yeah.
It's got his love of having a room that in plan is very large, but has got, and at the ground floor has got just sort of columns in it, but those columns quickly become piers, which quickly become vaults.
Yeah.
And then light is brought in behind that.
Yeah. There's a really nice series of, this is true of several of the Westminster commissions, there's a series of Gandhi on-site watercolours going through, I think working in ink and then with sort of some washes going through the different spaces. So that's looking up the Scala Regia. And I think picking up on lots of details that then are edited out of the official representations. So like the
very loose, multicoloured carpet.
Yeah, loads of Turkish rugs everywhere. The colour scheme is quite kind of candy cane. You've got like these sort of orange and pink columns.
It's the great Adam period restoration problem.
Yeah.
We go back to the authentic colours, and then the client has to go, I'm not sure I really want it in bright orange, avocado, and neon pink.
Yeah. But it looks very fun. It looks very George IV, doesn't it? It looks like looks grand.
Yes, camp.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if we've really done justice to that, but we've got quite a lot of things to talk
but we've got a whole load more buildings.
Lots of interesting stuff. So
Soane did a lot of projects.
He did a lot of projects, and basically all of this stuff is happening in the 1820s. There's a rush of building, and they're kind of building out the kind of offices of government. And so he has a big commission on the corner of Whitehall and Downing Street for the offices of the Board of Trade and also a meeting room for the Privy Council. Sounds ridiculous, but is quite an important organ of state.
Still more, I think it had judicial functions outside of England. And I can't remember. At the moment, it doesn't do very much.
No.
It has some things to do with the honour system.
It's a kind of a bauble, I think, for long-serving politicians now.
If you want to get rid of someone and be nice to them, you can make them a Privy Councillor.
And it's interesting because so we're looking at a picture of a model in the Soane Museum. They've got a big wooden model of it. It's very much an institutional-looking building, isn't it? It's a long,
well, it's funny. It's
rectangular.
Not that different to the building that's there on the site now.
Yeah.
Which, in fact, I think has some tiny bits of this building left in it. But there's almost nothing.
It's a big cuboid. It's got a grid of windows. It's got columns on the outside. It's neoclassical in style.
It's 2 big stories. So ground story, little square windows above it, and a lot of accommodation in an attic above that.
But this is basically what...
And a doorway and an entranceway in the middle.
It actually, in plan, sort of turns the corner. It's a sort of L shape. On Downing Street, it kind of goes a bit down the street, and that's actually where the Privy Council meeting room is on the first floor there.
Yeah. This is... on the other side of the road now has got the Foreign Office.
Yeah.
Commonwealth Office. And it's where the gates are now.
Yeah.
And there's a building that looks not too dissimilar to it. Privy Council bits going down towards the Cabinet Office.
Yeah.
In terms of the accommodation of the building, it's an L. The Board of Trade is the long part of the L, which goes along Whitehall. It has a circulation system which is on the ground floor. There's a corridor going down the middle with rooms off either side of it. In the centre of the long bit of the L, there's an entrance hall with a big ceremonial staircase. Above that, the same corridor is repeated, but now it's 2 stories tall.
Yeah.
Very tall and narrow and top lit. Interesting long corridor.
Yeah.
Quite Soanian, with staircases at either end of it, but set off. And that's got all the Board of Trade infrastructure on it. And there's another circulation above, kind of, I think, on a gallery of the corridor. And then going round the corner of one end of that is the block for the Privy Council, which has got a library on the ground floor and some other bits and another entrance hall. And this very interesting Privy Council chamber at the end of the short branch of the L on Downing Street.
I mean, we're going to hear the same story over and over again, which is there's a political controversy about the style of this building.
And they end up very dissatisfied with what they get.
I mean, maybe we should just say what Soane wanted to do. So he wanted to use the order of the Temple of Vesta in Tivoli, again.
Like the Bank of England.
Which was his favourite one. And he wanted to do a thing where... So you'd have this kind of continuous row of columns, if you imagine. But at one end of the building itself would sort of push out and attach to the columns. So that at one end, the columns would be sort of 3/4 and attached to the wall and projecting. And then across the rest of the facade, they would be isolated.
Insulated, they call it.
Aren't they? When are they insulated? When they're attached or when they're not attached?
I presume it's when they are an island, an insule.
Oh, okay, yeah. And that, among other things, is found to be unacceptable by the people from the Treasury.
Basically, what he's doing is thickening up and making the end that goes round onto Downing Street stronger. And also, the attic story projects forward, so you have the appearance of a building that's one story taller, even though it's the same height. Really, all of this is just making very small moves to thicken up and emphasise the corner.
Yeah, so it's the Chancellor of the Exchequer is a guy called Robinson. He objects to this kind of idea of the colonnade on stylistic grounds, because he thinks that the difference in the play of shadows will be wrong. And he also objects to the use of the order of the Temple of Vesta at Tivoli, because he says it's kind of universally known that that example of the Corinthian order is defective by reason of the excessive smallness of its capital.
So, I mean, if we want to actually... I mean, firstly, it's quite interesting that the Chancellor of the Exchequer is arguing about the design of the column capitals on a building.
Yeah. And I think this goes to a select committee. Like, I think this is one of the many... what happens with a lot of these buildings is that they end up being... the question ends up being heard by a committee of Parliament.
This is the problem when people think they've got good taste. The Tivoli column capitals are unusual. They are atypical Corinthian capitals. And he wants what he calls the ones of Jupiter Stator, which I think is a temple which doesn't exist. But I think he means... Temple of Castor and Pollux.
Yeah.
And they are exactly what you'd think if you saw a Corinthian capital. They're the ones that are used everywhere.
Yeah.
And the Tivoli ones are the cutting is deeper, the capital is smaller, it's got a flower on it. It's quite fun to see them now because they're different to all of the other ones. And I think what you've got going on here is Soane goes, these ones are the nicest, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer goes, they're not the ones that are the most conventional.
Yeah.
Convention is good taste, and I'm the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And I think if you end up in a committee stage, people are going to always choose the thing that is conventionally regarded as good, rather than is possibly actually interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot of... I mean, all of these buildings kind of get into a bit of design by committee. Yeah, Soane produces these kind of analytical drawings so that they can properly discuss the difference between these examples of the orders. And actually, the thing is, in real life, the Temple of Vesta is much smaller than what they thought of as this Temple of Jupiter. But although that doesn't really matter, because you can just make them arbitrarily big or small, it does mean adopting this other example of the Corinthian order, because Soane sort of forces them then to follow through exactly on all of the details. Then means that the kind of upper bit and all of the pediments and everything, the architraves, all get much bigger and blow the budget. There are lots of sorts of diary entries where he's bemoaning this fact, all of which arises from his kind of antiquarian kind of pedantry, I think, because you could just have... Like, no one would notice if you put the architrave from this side on that one, or if you just switched the design of the... And I feel like if it was James Wyatt building it, he would just do whatever. Like... He probably
The
wouldn't even
problem is,
draw that. He would just tell them to do one.
The problem is that John Soane, more than the other architects of the period, is really into architecture.
Yeah.
He's much more into architecture than Wyatt or Smirk or Nash.
Yeah.
These people are all kind of operators.
Yeah.
He's a maniac.
Yeah.
I mean, he's also an operator, but
He's got certain sort of rules.
well, it's funny because he doesn't follow the rules of classical proportion at all.
No.
What a load of nonsense.
Yeah.
His buildings are not convincingly.
I think it's because they've kind of said,
I think because they've said,
we want that temple. So he's going to really give it to them, and he's going to make them regret.
in a fit of pique, yes.
He's going to regret the fact that they specified this, because he's going to give them the most correct version of it, and it's going to cost about 10 times as much.
And look almost the same.
Yeah. Exactly the same thing. His kind of dream is to dress as much as possible of the kind of government precinct and Downing Street in this sort of classical facade. And he's continuously trying to grow the brief to enable him to do the whole sort of district. And he has where you can sort of see that he's starting to put a bit of kind of facing onto the other side.
Part of the
Downing
reason
Street.
he wants to thicken up the Downing Street corner on that side is he wants a matching one on the other.
Yeah.
And in fact, he'd like to match the whole thing.
Yeah. Oh, should we talk about the Privy Council?
Let's talk about the Privy
first?
Council, because the Privy Council's got
Yeah.
a really cool room in it, and quite a cool. So the Privy Council had its own entrance, although it was accessible off the end of the big corridor in the Board of Trade. The best bits of the accommodation throughout the Board of Trade are on the first floor of a 3-storey building. The Privy Council is a double height space on the first floor, and it occupies almost all of the end, the short bit of the L, with a kind of grand domed staircase lobby leading up to it. The room is, what's the proportion like? 2 to 3, something like that.
Yeah,
It's a bit longer than it's wide. Perhaps 5'4", actually.
Yeah.
It's nearly square, but slightly longer.
But it's within this kind of it's got this sort of anteroom that's part of it as well. There's like a big room and an anteroom.
Yeah.
And then the big room has aisles which become corridors on either side of the anteroom. So yeah, it's kind of, should we go back to the picture of what it's like inside?
And those aisles are very tall, and they have lanterns at the top.
Yeah.
As you would expect, and the core middle bit has this star dome, which he's very fond of, which feels superficially like a very low version of his pendentive dome.
How do you describe
Geometrically? Okay, so if you had a groin vault, and then you chamfered away at the arises of the groin vault, at the point where the groins come together, a little bit, and had a sort of flat square in the middle of the groin vault that you'd taken out, you'd get these triangles going down again toward the corners. So you've got the ellipse base going between the corners, the 4 corners.
Yeah.
And then they go out to kind of triangular sections of groin vault. And then there are shaved away thin triangles going to a square in the centre.
Yeah.
That will be completely incomprehensible in audio.
Yeah.
You'll just have to look one up.
I'm trying to work out how to construct it geometrically. It's quite complicated. It's quite an amazing thing, and it's a sort of elongated, and it's this funny thing of the ceiling of the room is lower down, is like a building inside a building. It's a kind of structure lower down than the aisles on either side, which are letting all of the light in. It's a very peculiar effect. And then it's got these 4 porch doorways, one of which is a real door, and the others of which I think are either windows or niches, which are ionic, with a very heavy feeling. It kind of looks like a sarcophagus on top of it, and they're yellow columns.
Yeah, the bits on top feel a bit like the bits on the top of the Tivoli corner or places in the old Bank of England that got removed. Yeah, and they're very loose yellow marble.
This again is a kind of sort of record type watercolour. So we get the very bright red velvet chairs they would have had, and the lovely big Persian carpets on the ground. It's a very cool space.
They hated it.
Yeah, they hated it. They wanted to get rid of all of these columns on the walls. It stops us from using the room as we intend, I think, was what they said. But given that it's a meeting room, I don't really understand. He's continuously pushing to try and make Whitehall actually look like a proper government district for a proper big grand country like France. his big idea for that is basically to sort of double the Board of Trade type treatment on the other side of Downing Street. So you'd have two symmetrical ones facing into each other and then have a big triumphal arch in the middle.
And crucially, they are, I mean, at the moment, Whitehall's straight, a straight road going down.
Yeah.
But he's got it that they are reflected, but at an angle. The entrance to Downing Street is funneling in. I don't really know how that would go on, because Whitehall does go down straight eventually.
Yeah.
At some point, there would be some sort of problem.
Maybe
there.
they were going to demolish all this stuff on the left-hand side and build it at a different angle or something. Yeah.
This would have been funny, because it's a really kind of heroic, heralding entrance to Downing Street, and then behind you would presumably have the same hodgepodge of 17th century houses at the back that there is there now.
I mean, this is distinctly kind of Elysian, isn't it? It's so different from the character of actual Downing Street as it exists.
I mean,
there is a gate on it now, I guess.
There is a gate, and the buildings are even grander, because, I mean, that would be the Foreign Office, the one on the other side.
Yeah, well,
which is a big,
which is huge
white,
now.
Stony thing.
Yeah.
But several stories taller. And, in fact, the Board of Trade building, I think, is another story taller as well. And actually, I think the space leading up to the gate, with the two buildings sort of tapering in towards each other, would have been quite fun with these kind of pavilions.
There are these pictures of it by Gandhi again. Oh yeah, there's one with an extremely forced perspective.
Yes, here you would think they were splayed apart by
60 degrees or something. Yeah,
one would almost say 90.
Yeah,
they're not. Also, it's somehow sort of made the arch deeper, his triumphal arch. Also, he's made the it seemed like there's a really deep recess that colonnade's behind, but it's just the depth of the column.
He did do a few interiors in actual number 10 and 11 Downing Street, which are to some extent still there. And
they're almost the only bits from this whole. I think there's a room in the old Board of Trade building that's still there, and there are two rooms, one in number 10 and number 11. Yeah. This was the eating room. As distinct from the dining room, and it's a surviving pendentive roof with roof lights on the two sides of it.
Yeah, with this very high aisle design. Yeah.
In the photograph, you really can't see what it's like because they've got so much artificial light on it. And there's a rather bigger, grander, well, without the roof lights, in 10 Downing Street, which is the State Dining Room. Mm. Oh, Christ, there's another huge complex of buildings to discuss.
Okay. It's okay, just take a breath. So we've talked about all this stuff, and we still haven't talked about what's actually the most famous Soane involvement in Westminster, which is with the courts. In the 1820s, he is involved with, he designs a new complex
and they build
court spaces. Yeah, they build, which are amazing and which have a very strange site. So they're built on the west side of Westminster Hall.
It's basically that bit where the statue of Cromwell is now.
Yeah, which is sort of weird sort of sunken garden now.
And he fit like 12 courts in there.
Yeah, how many are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I think might have missed one. I think at least 8.
Yeah, there's the Bale Court as well.
Oh yeah, which are all fitted in there. Among the kind of unpropitious things about the site, it's full of the flying buttresses of Westminster Hall, which need to be left in place because they're holding up the building. And there's also an existing building, which was built by a guy called Vardy in the earlier 18th century, called the Stone Building, which is sort of vaguely...
Which was half finished. And they built the facade for perhaps half the site, and not much behind it. The rest of the site was full of like bars. The image we're looking at now is part of a panorama, which is in the Museum of London, which is great to look at. You can see all sorts of things in the panorama. But this bit you can see, firstly, you can see the Palace of Westminster, and it doesn't look very big and impressive. It looks pretty nondescript. There's the big roof of the hall behind, which has got loads of funny roof lights in it, which are not present now. Which really look like 18th century Veluxes. But I guess all of the windows are blocked up on the sides. There is this heavy Palladian building, which has got a tower on the corner with a big semicircular, I mean, not sort of, a window that goes up and has a semicircular top and comes down in a reveal of the same shape.
Yeah.
And then it sort of proceeds along, 3 stories tall, rusticated layer, rectangular window, square window, band, and there's a sort of Palladian centre, and then it sort of peters out and turns into little Gothic buildings, rather nondescript, which had bars in them and cafes and things like that. If we could see behind this facade, we would see it's almost one room or sometimes 2 rooms thick, and then there's some more funny buildings right behind it, sandwiched between it and the hall,
Yeah.
with almost no access from anywhere. Presumably, you go through the back of the coffee house,
Yeah.
and then there's a little square, tiny, between, with a sort of bit of Gothic masonry on one side, and you turn in, and then there's a woodshed.
So that's where
That's
he's
the
got-
beating heart of our democracy
That's where we gotta
at the
build
time. And he's told, can you put in there the Court of King's Bench, the Court of Equity, the Chancellor's Court, the Bail Court, Vice Chancellery,
Yeah.
the Court of Exchequer, the Court of Pleas.
Various anti-rooms and sort of rooms for the judges.
Yeah, could you put them in sort of like the bit where the woodshed is, and
Yeah.
and where there are 2 pubs at the moment? And he does it.
He does it. They're all fitted in between the descending flying buttresses.
Well,
from
not
the
all,
Gothic building.
because there aren't enough buttresses.
Yeah, but
But each buttress has a court.
has at least one court in the gap, and then they're all. It's an amazing plan, and it has this very long corridor, which in this case sort of runs along the edge of Westminster Hall, so sort of between Westminster Hall and the new building.
It starts with various attempts to fit these thick courts in, and struggle, and complicated plans with complicated circulations. And it evolves towards something that is simple and clear and seems obvious, but I don't think is obvious at all.
Yeah,
Which is actually a complicated dual circulation, which has got a kind of ring corridor well behind the front facade, going round the back of, goes along the side of Westminster Hall with this huge masonry tucked underneath the flying buttresses, loops round, and then kind of loops round the back of the old stone building, and then into a new corridor with a new kind of entrance section, and then loops up into a corner with a tower and another court in it. He manages to fit an awful lot in. Now, he isn't able to provide a lot of very grand kind of communicating spaces, but he's able to fit in and accommodate quite well an awful lot of stuff in a very tricky site.
and each of these courts are different. I mean, just by reason of their location, each of them is a kind of variation on this idea of a sort of top-lit space. They all have to be top-lit because obviously there's no way they could have any windows. I thought we could talk through, there's a set of site record perspectives again. These are some of the favourite thing that I found in the archive. This set of site record watercolours by Gandhi. So this one is the Court of Equity, which is a kind of square one with a lantern in the middle. A lot of them have, I guess this is just conventional for courts. It's a double height space and you have sort of wood panelling up to a certain height.
Yeah, I don't know why they do that, but it's certainly conventional in British courts.
Certainly looks like a court.
And
This
we
one-
have a complicated ceiling.
Yeah, the ceiling is really strange, isn't it? I mean, it's a kind of a flat ceiling, but it's got this very complicated sort of decoration on it.
And this is actually a Soane motif, but here it's different. So if I just describe that, and you have a much smaller version of this in his house, and there was some, I think, in the bank as well. It's, if you imagine if you start with a strip hanging down from the ceiling, and then you cut semicircles out of it, and you put little nodules on it, but then you grid it up. It's almost going a bit towards one of the ceilings in Palaguel or something like that.
Yeah.
That we dealt with that were very complicated.
Yeah, there are things a bit like this in the Alhambra, but they're not on a flat plane.
And it feels a bit Tudory, but in this case it's quite shrunk down and feels a bit stuck on. And there's a double height lantern, which is quite complicated. I can't work out in 3D exactly what we're looking at.
No.
I think there might be a space. I don't think those 2 sets of windows are in the same plane.
There's one is pushed back or something.
I think the lower one, there's that arch, and then there's a bit of ceiling, and then there's those windows, and then the top one.
Yeah,
that's my feeling.
Complex.
And there's a clerestory, as well.
So quite often in these, this is the Court of Exchequer, which is slightly.
It's a bigger, grander court.
Yeah, this one's got clerestory windows, which are little sort of precious little semicircular windows all the way around. And this is a thing that he sort of starts to develop in these where they're kind of nesting different ceiling forms inside each other. So there's a kind of square band on the outside, and then there is a little bit of a kind of complex sort of pendentive dome thing, and then there's a lantern which is a cylindrical lantern punched through that, but then it looks like there's actually a square lantern on this on the outside of it, so the lantern's bigger than the hole
with a pendentive dome on top.
Yeah, but again, it's like building up. Sort of nesting. It's a kind of nesting structure of different complicated things, one on top of each other.
There's the court, which is the wood lining goes up very high.
Yeah.
There's a clerestory. There's a double big cornice, which has a little reveal. There's a pendentive dome. There's a circle cut on the top of the pendentive dome, with a square lantern on top, little columns around, with lunette windows, under another pendentive dome on the top. Do you know what goes on in the Court of Common Pleas?
I don't know what goes on in any of them. Are these all of these for civil cases, or are they?
No, they're not all for civil cases. No.
This is a kind of version of the like building inside a building type one. It's got a kind of room with sort of arched openings on every side, but then there's a kind of it's inside a larger volume. So you've got aisles with light coming down into them, and then you've got a sort of smaller rectangular lantern on top, and then in this case the kind of rectangular form of it has like sort of brackets, like big expressed brackets,
like big long console brackets,
which feel very big and heavy and which is all holding up the
and also I presume we have it's another one of these where you've got arches inside a space, but on two sides it actually goes out further and there's light coming down, and circulation on one side, and the other side's got the judge's bench, which is quite ceremonial in this case.
This is really nice. So and this one has like a different axis from the ones that we've seen so far. It's like a wide one, which is kind of wide across one way, and the judge is on the wide side. What's this one? The bail court is the littlest one, which is very similar. Again, it's like a mini-me version of that.
Except I think it might be lit. Although it's very small, I think it has 4 columns within the room and it's lit on all sides and a lantern.
Yeah.
And I think it was properly tight.
Yeah, this is a tiny little one. It's only got like 2 benches in it. The Vice-Chancellor's Court is a bigger one. I don't know if I've just missed them, but I feel like there's really hardly any sections. I don't know. These rooms
These also survived into the 1880s.
Yeah.
I haven't found... I mean, we have a limited amount of time to do research, particularly at the moment.
Yeah.
But I haven't found photographs of them.
Yeah.
The 1880s is late enough on that there should be.
Yeah. They've got super complicated, very, very layered, very, very complex sections, and I haven't found like really good descriptions of what they're like, and we're trying to read a lot of this from how they appear in a watercolour perspective, which is obviously not...
By someone who's known for doing rather misleading watercolour perspectives.
Yeah, the Vice-Chancellor's Court is much kind of whiter. Almost feels... We've got a bit of a kind of garden room feeling, doesn't it? It unusually has like large, well-lit openings on ground level, and it has...
I think it's on the corner of the site, isn't it?
Yeah, it might be. And it has a relatively small lantern in this case. Yeah, it feels... relatively kind of less intensely layered than the other ones. Oh yeah, but then actually, so this is looking at it through the arch at the back. Yeah, so you kind of look into it. There's a kind of anteroom space with a flat arch, flattish arch looking into it. King's Bench is quite a cool one because it's got... So you've got that kind of wooden datum a bit above head height, about 3 meters or whatever. And then in this case, you've got like big, deep windows with kind of columned arches, like very grand, monumental windows looking out through the walls. And actually inside the windows is a gallery, a kind of inhabitable gallery. So the like depth of the window, there's a sort of inner pier and an outer pier and a corridor running through, which you can get around the inside of. And this view, which we actually talked about...
There is circulation at the first floor. Yeah. Which doesn't crop up in the plans in a way that's particularly
easy
legible.
To understand. Yeah. So you could kind of walk all the way around the top here and see what's going on. This one, which we talked about in our Gandhi bonus, is actually from up inside that strange little gallery, and it's got all this stuff on the side. These sort of, what are these? Are these ways into little offices or something? These kind of look like shop windows.
Yeah.
Kind of complex internal glazing, and then these little, again, very fine skylights running all the way down. What an amazing thing. So much of this. And then probably the best one is the Court of Chancery, which is the most complex kind of nesting of ceiling forms. I mean, how do you describe that? That is...
Well, you've got the room is almost square. The ground section of it is lined in timber. There is a circle cut above that level, which goes down to the very, I mean, I guess it's a pendentive dome,
Yeah.
but it's very, very shallow and there's very little of it. Circular holes are punched through that, and I think you could walk on that higher level.
I think that's a gallery.
It's a gallery, but with holes cut in the floor to let light through. Above that gallery, there's a cornice band of kind of this decorated deep semicircular cut ceiling with bosses.
Yeah.
Which then goes up to another cornice. And above that, there's another cornice. This is kind of getting smaller in squares, which has got big brackets on it. And then above that, there's a lantern with sort of thermal windows in it. And above that, I think there's a pendentive dome.
Yeah. It would be a relatively high room with a relatively flat arch, but they've just cut like a big circle in the flat arch, and there's a whole gallery and everything on top.
In other paintings that Gandhi did, this room looks considerably taller than it is wide, which is not the impression you get from this painting.
Yeah.
But this painting seems to be taken from a place that doesn't exist.
A picture of, somebody hiding inside a little hole in the wall or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is another amazingly wide-angle perspective. I mean, I think that there's something interesting about Soane's relationship to... I was thinking about the picturesque, and a lot of Soane's rivals are picturesque architects, like guys like John Nash. He's known as a picturesque architect. What he's interested in is a work of architecture which produces this kind of spectacular effect in a certain context, but he's not really interested in its spatiality, and he certainly doesn't really give a shit about the detail.
Soane is a much better architect than Nash.
Soane again and again creates spaces which are actually impossible to picture.
Yeah.
And what you're seeing in these Gandhi representations, these sort of absurd wide-angle perspectives, is he's creating these intensely powerful and carefully worked and extremely inventive spaces which are unrepresentable in a kind of picturesque fashion. But he's nevertheless such a massive fan of pictures, and he's kind of dedicated to try and represent his architecture.
Oh, these are much more picturesque, as in... If the picturesque is the thing between the sublime and the beautiful, they're much more like that. They're too small and human to be sublime and terrifying, these rooms. But they have got very interesting bulk mass properties, which are very complicated and work at a number of scales with complicated light.
It is, but I mean, a lot of the picturesque is literally that you stand in a particular place and the architecture
looks like
makes a picture, which Soane's architecture never does, because that's kind of A, not possible, and B, he's actually working spatially. He's producing things which are for you to be inside.
He's not very good at flat surfaces.
Yeah.
He's good at, once he's got a big complicated mass to play with, he can make interesting things. But he has rooms that are a certain size, and then he puts a lot of things in them that make them smaller, and create subdivisions of the room. A lot of his most interesting spaces is doing the same thing again and again, which is you've got a room which is a large, distinct shape, and then you kind of have a sort of semi-virtual space within that, which could be defined by piers, arches, vaults, subdivisions of the ceiling, galleries, which dissolves the first big massive form, which is kind of there in presence, and creates a kind of secondary, the kind of bit within it, and tertiary spaces, the smaller bits that are kind of cut out. The interplay of those different scales creates a geometrically interesting effect, but it also allows for different plays of light, and light to arrive from unseen sources. It's fairly unusual for people creating a grand space to resist the urge to make it as big as possible, and to not play using different things that can create the feeling of bigness, even when you're kind of...
you've got to have...
the size of the space isn't changing, but...
to create a sort of sense that there's always... it's to create something that's not static. I mean, that, you create these spaces where you can't see everything in the space from one place. You can't. It's not a simple thing to apprehend, and there's a constant sense of things behind other things. It's what makes them kind of enjoyable and fascinating to move through, and they kind of move you as a person actually in those spaces, moving between those spaces and encountering these kinds of visual thresholds and sort of events and changes in your understanding of your kind of situatedness as an actual person in a space, rather than standing on a particular hill and seeing something which looks like a picture.
Yeah.
Which is, very nice in its way, but is kind of scenography rather than architecture, I think.
I don't think there's anyone else working in London at this time who could do something this interesting.
No, I don't think there's anyone who's done a space like this.
Yeah.
It's crazy. And these are definitely also, I think probably the Court of Chancery is the kind of most complicated version of this particular exploration of a kind of centralised top-lit space. There's so much stuff going into it.
Yeah, I mean, he's managed to get, in a rather unpromising site, he's managed to get an awful lot of extra architecture stuff, hasn't he?
Yeah.
Which is really sort of playful exploration of space into an already pretty packed site. He really works best when he's got unpromising ground.
Yeah. The corridors are lovely as well.
Give him carte blanche, and he will produce some rather second-rate classes.
Rather boring.
But
there are these. What's one of the things which is nice in the kind of record drawings are these like drawings of the corridors as well. I think this is one of
which are quite in the plan, quite tight and small.
Yeah.
I suspect we're on 2 floors, but top lit, which would have meant that they felt a lot bigger and nicer.
Yeah. I think that's the door into Westminster Hall. You've got these kind of Gothic doors on one side.
So this is the long corridor that wraps around the back.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, so this is actually the controversy to end all controversies. There's a huge number of. If you search for the word "select committee" in the Soane archive, you can get a huge number of plans that all relate to a controversy over the facade of the building. So I think in his original intention was, we've got this existing bit of building, which is this kind of Italianate, sort of vaguely sort of Palladio influenced thing, and we should just kind of continue it round, finish that off. That's the logical way to complete the facade. But this becomes the subject of real controversy.
It's not even his design.
Yeah. It's not, no.
It's not very distinguished.
So you can see why this would drive you absolutely mad, being involved in this controversy. People in Parliament feel that the way that this kind of, you end up with this kind of Italianate return joining the front of Westminster Hall, and that it's all just wrong.
Yeah, Westminster Hall was revered.
Yeah.
And I suppose still is.
Yeah, although weirdly it's kind of a bit swallowed in the new...
It's not for anything now either.
Yeah, we need to bring back big state banquets, really. That's the...
Put the trials on there.
The only time I've ever been in there, there were a lot of rather sad banner poster things from some kind of fair.
Yeah, it's one of the least promising places to have a trade junket.
Yeah.
They tend to put them on in the Foreign Office. Yes, because this is sort of dark and medieval, but also lacking. It was so overgrown with courts and things that once they were stripped out, it had this it's very stripped out. It had everything except the basic fabric of the building and the roof is taken away. A bit blank and cold and medieval.
Yeah, I forget the exact story, but essentially various people in Parliament condemn what's going on here. And the whole thing, I think
something happened, which is that they knocked down all those pubs and things.
Yeah.
And then they saw there's an old Gothic building! They said, what? You're going to build some not particularly exciting facades around it?
Yeah, so it enters a period of design by committee, which I think goes on for quite a long time.
But it's all based around distinctions that really make almost no difference.
Yeah. There are 2 things. There's a style problem, and there's also, it's felt to be inappropriate that it comes so far forward up to the kind of facade of Westminster Hall. The 2 things that emerge as sort of demands are to set it back a bit, which is...
This is along its sort of short side.
Yeah, which is inconvenient because they're already short of space as it is. Lots of...
Absurdly short of space. Comically short of space.
And also to kind of restyle that end to make it Gothic.
Make some good mock Gothic edge.
Yeah, so I think this is we're looking at a picture of what I think is a model from that period. And he does various schemes. He kind of does a design in his preferred style of Gothic, which is a bit more kind of rayonnant. Lots of nice kind of windows.
They were
and
well
things.
into crenulating at this point, weren't they?
Yeah. What they want and what he eventually is forced to kind of go along with is a octagonal tower at the corner.
Yes.
And then a big sort of dog-legging step
Yes,
back.
there's discussion in the select committee about whether it should be 18 or 20 foot wide or something.
Yeah.
It's a very, very little octagonal tower.
Yeah, they kind of end up with this sort of solution, and you can see that the whole experience had slightly driven him insane, I think.
And it's fine. What they do is fine. Like, the facades of this building are not interesting. By doing a lot of design by committee, managed to make something not very interesting marginally worse.
Yeah. And yeah, in his book of London designs, there's a lot of time is spent on options for the facade of this.
So we could build a whole nother one on the other side as well.
Yeah, he proposed it. There are 3 proposals, none of which are the one which actually had been agreed and was being built. He was like, well, this is what it could have been like with a kind of slightly grander version of the sort of Italianate scheme. And then there's a different Gothic one, but kind of coming a bit further forward, which he would have preferred. And then there's one which is, again, not really like the one that was built, but where he's created a symmetrical facade across the front of Westminster Hall. It must have been a very frustrating process to be involved in. And
then they built it and everyone was dissatisfied with it.
Yeah.
Because no one saw the design of the courts, except if they were litigants in one way or another.
Yeah.
And everyone saw this somewhat unsatisfactory facade, which
Yeah.
we're seeing a photograph from 1880 of,
Which
is a continuation of the old building, and then this design by committee thing, none of which was really him.
Yeah.
When it gets to the point where the client is saying, on the corner, you've got to have an octagonal tower, which has got to be this wide, with sides this big and this tall. The crenellations have got to be like that.
Yes. Idiots.
And it was unloved.
Yeah.
Rather as Wyatt's work was unloved in the Palace of Westminster as well.
So this bit did survive. I mean, to cut a long story short, the Lords and Commons did burn down in Soane's lifetime in 1834. I mean, the walls of a lot of them survived, but the interiors were consumed. They kind of got stuck into a project of rebuilding it all in the 1840s and 50s.
Yeah.
Which has yielded the
current building,
one
which is much, much bigger.
One that you see today, which is absolutely much bigger. One of the things I didn't realise about it is that the design does still incorporate some of the kind of layout of the original site, even when it's not the original fabric. So St Stephen's Chapel, the Commons as it was, is sort of still preserved in this slightly off-axis.
And the cloister as well. I don't know how much of that cloister is actually original. I mean, it's all in grey there, and all these lovely yards, which have become car parks now.
And they're building up to burning it down again, I think, probably. It's gonna. Well, everyone keeps saying it will burn down if we don't do it up, but actually what will happen is that they'll start doing it up and then they'll burn it down.
Then it'll burn down. That's always how it goes.
Yeah.
Get the scaffolding up and then...
burn it down.
And in fact, during the Second World War, when it was being bombed, certainly the story is that they said the same thing in the fire that burnt down the original palace. They said, save the hall. And the hall and the House of Commons were on fire. And they saved the hall again and let the House of Commons burn out. When they rebuilt it, they said, do it exactly the same, but lighter. So it's all got lighter wood.
But anyway, that's what's there now. That's the kind of site of what was Soane's law courts now as this rather desolate, sort of sunken green with a big statue of Cromwell in it.
The only bit surviving from all of this that we've discussed today are the 2 dining rooms on Downing Street.
Yeah.
And apparently there's 2 rooms
From the Board of Trade.
from the Board of Trade, which I've not seen a photograph of, even though they exist now, apparently. The Board of Trade stuff was reworked, I think, in the 1830s and 40s.
Yeah.
Courts were demolished in the 1880s. And the rest burnt down
Yeah.
in his lifetime.
Yeah. Yes, so yeah, he would have lived to see... the Royal Gallery and all that stuff I presumably did burn down. It was that end of it that burnt. I love these court spaces. They're so interesting. And there's something for me very gratifying about like 8 different variations on exactly the same idea with small changes.
Yeah.
Really, really interesting. Really, really interesting. And I want to see the sections. I want to really understand how it goes together because I'm trying to infer a lot of it.
It'd be nice to see photographs of it.
Yeah.
It seems quite likely to me that there should be some.
Yeah.
Demolished in the mid-1880s, it's not that early.
It feels like there should be some. Maybe some clever person could let us know if,
Yes.
if they discover any. It'd be very interesting for us to see.
The trouble with Soane is he did a lot of projects.
Go
We've
on,
actually
yeah.
skipped over several more.
We're going to try and
Smash
rattle
through a whole
through
load more.
a bunch of other urban ones, and then hopefully get onto the home straight and the house and that kind of thing. I was feeling very energised during the bank one, but this one has felt like a tiny bit of a sort of death march
too much.
through Siberia. So
We don't have much to go on. You can't go there.
yeah.
These are only written about by people doing their PhD.
The evidence is both copious and only partially kind of documented and ambiguous.
Copious and difficult.
Yeah. Congrats to anyone who has managed to make sense of it. I would love someone to do like a high-res facsimile of all of these site record watercolours, because I feel like it'd be such a great, it's such a lovely thing. They are. Okay, look, if you are listening to the podcast for the first time, you can find all sorts of links to things that you might want to know about us on aboutbuildingsandcities.org, including...
This is available as video for those of you who are doing it in audio, which can make it easier to understand what's going on. Although I do understand it's more distracting.
Yeah, you occasionally have to look at us.
Faces for radio.
Yeah. Yeah. And then some. But what was I going to say?
We've done some bonuses for this. There's a good bonus on Gandhi coming out soon, or possibly already come out. Presumably already come out by this time, I thought. Which you can get by making a modest contribution.
Yes, a modest contribution on Patreon, a crowdfunding subscription platform. All the links to everything are on our website. Yeah, thank you very much for listening. Thanks a lot to Matt for doing the editing on these very large and unwieldy episodes.
Yeah, I think we're getting through it. I hadn't even heard of half this stuff before, so
yeah.
Yeah,
I'm sure it's known to proper historians, but it doesn't feel like it gets an enormous amount of airplay. So we're doing our part, and hopefully you keep listening.
Okay.
All right.
Good night.
Bye bye.